Yeah, got a good play on name there. Unfortunately, the horse, is murdered. So you have to figure out who did it there.
This is great. What about murder at the reunion?
Murder at the reunion. So that's basically you've got characters that have a character back in the day and what they are now. So that's quite funny. Seeing like the alpha female, for example, she's now a stand-in bridesmaid. And basically you have to work out who killed your favourite teacher.
Is it a better evening if you're a good bunch of actors, or can anybody do it?
Anybody can do it, and what we've done is we've rated the characters with a 3-star rating. So if you're more outgoing, then your host will give you a 3-star, and if you're less outgoing, a little bit more shy, you'd give a 1-star character.
Oh, I'm a 1-star, definitely.
Gosh, that's a bit scary that your friends would rate you.
Sorry?
Wendell.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I love Agatha Christie and Poirot, and I just can watch those too. And they're just sitting there and guessing and trying to work out. So, I mean, for anyone who likes those kind of things, this is perfect, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite funny as the host listening to everybody's guesses at the end, because I've always known, because I've written them, I've known who's done it. So it's really funny when people get really, really off track and you're trying to work out how they got to that.
Good on you, Yvonne.
It's really funny.
Malcolm Murder Mysteries. Do a search and check it out. And Tom says, I'm on a tractor right now, listen to your show. I'm ploughing around in ever-decreasing circles, dreaming of being a superhero called Tractor Boy. On that note, Mike Ruhu, Wendell Niston, thank you very much for being with me today.
E noho.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere nei, a surprise visit to our toughest jail reveals a grim list of failings. Prisoners locked down for up to 23 hours a day, high rates of sexual assaults and evidence of cruelty against inmates, and misreporting by guards. What exactly is going on behind the wire? Australia, when the bloody hell are ya? Coming, that is. A bubble's on the way, but businesses want an exact date. The government's coughing up for Christchurch homeowners shortchanged by Southern Response, but won't say how much. Sweeping changes to the way our blood service screens potential donors for the risk of HIV, and secrecy surrounds a potential deal over Ihumatao.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leatawa tēnei. The border between New Zealand and Australia is scheduled to be reopened for travel by March next year. The announcement's been made by the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern after today's Cabinet meeting. New Zealand has been under pressure from Australia to restore pre-COVID travel arrangements and end the mandatory 14-day quarantine for trans-Tasman arrivals. Quarantine-free travel will also require Australian government approval and COVID case numbers staying at rock bottom. New Zealand has also agreed to start a bubble with the Cook Islands, which has not had a single case of COVID-19 within the same timeframe. As part of its preparations for a trans-Tasman bubble, the government is investigating where it could isolate thousands of New Zealanders if there was an outbreak in Australia. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says the government is preparing contingency plans in case of an outbreak in Australia and large numbers of New Zealanders returning home.
If there were an outbreak, for instance, in Australia, and it's not a hypothetical, there have been several, we would need to make arrangements to have potentially thousands of New Zealanders brought back to New Zealand in numbers that we wouldn't be able to facilitate necessarily in managed isolation.
Jacinda Ardern says officials are still working this out and they'd prefer not to ask people to self-isolate at home. A report into the country's only maximum security prison reveals a myriad of problems and shows it is failing on promises to boost rehabilitation. The Chief Ombudsman Peter Bosher inspected Mount Eden Prison in Auckland unannounced and found prisoners were being locked in cells for 22 to 23 hours a day, despite new units opening to aid rehabilitation. Eva Corlett reports.
Peter Bosher found prisoners were unable to access rehabilitation and education programs. He says that there are privacy issues with CCTV in the bathrooms and cruel treatment from staff. Staffing problems are leading to missed appointments and opportunities for prisoners. Mr Bosher made 37 recommendations. The Department of Corrections has accepted 33 and partially accepted 4. Ko Eva Corlett tēnei.
Mana whenua at Ihumatao say they are hopeful a resolution can finally be reached in the long-running land dispute. RNZ understand an agreement has been reached and a first step towards resolving the standoff over a proposed housing development on the historic Auckland site. Kiani Matata Sipu from the group Save Our Unique Landscape and Makoto Marae says there's been talk of a deal being reached before. She's hopeful this time there will be some progress, but she says this will just be the start of the resolution process. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has refused to confirm whether Cabinet Ministers have greenlit a deal on the Ihumatao standoff. The University of Otago is postponing all of this week's graduation ceremonies and parades following an online security threat against the attendees last week. 4 university and 1 Otago Polytechnic ceremony were postponed last week. Tess Brunton with this report.
It's been a year since the university last held in-person graduations. More than 2,500 university students were expecting to graduate over 2 weeks. Instead, there will be no graduations to end the year. Vice-Chancellor Professor Harleen Hayne says the decision was made this afternoon following continued discussion with the police. She says it's a further disappointment after a difficult year. The police are investigating the threat, but say they can't release any further details. Tess Brunton, TNA.
A union representing hospitality workers in central Auckland has warned they're being increasingly confronted by violent patrons. 3 people are before the courts after a recent series of shootings in or near bars and clubs. Gerard here from the Unite Union says any central city worker knows that Friday and Saturday nights often involve violence.
It is a problem. There is, if it's not direct physical violence, it is preceded with abuse, aggression.
Gerard here from the Unite Union. It's 4.5 minutes past 5. The stand-in New Zealand cricket captain Tom Latham says it was good to score a comprehensive victory over the West Indies without regular skipper Kane Williamson. With Williamson at home with his expectant wife, Latham led the side to an innings and 12-run win in the second test at the Basin Reserve to complete a 2-0 series sweep. Latham says the victory was set up by a solid batting performance on a demanding first day.
It was about everyone standing up and trying to put a performance on the board, and it was great they were able to do it without Kane. I think the way Youngie played on that first day was great. So it's great for our squad, and that we do have depth where guys can come in and perform straight away.
Tom Latham. The Black Caps now take on Pakistan in a T20 series starting in Auckland on Friday. Brisbane's Suncorp Stadium is being touted as a likely venue to host every Australian and New Zealand Super Rugby team over one weekend in a trans-Tasman Super Round next year. The draw for the combined 10-team competition to be played after both countries contest their respective domestic competitions has been released. A 5-round schedule will start on May 14th and culminate in a June 19th final, with all sides playing games in one location over one weekend in late May. But the venue is yet to be confirmed. The Highlanders will kick off the trans-Tasman competition when they host Queensland. That's the news.
The government considers a deal at Ihumatao. This would be the sale from Fletcher Building to the government of that parcel of land, and really this is the step that's needed to resolve any of the other issues.
But the Prime Minister remains tight-lipped. When we have an announcement on Ihumatao, we'll be making it.
As mana whenua continue to wait for resolution.
We've been here before in this campaign and in this whawhai to protect our whenua. It's always been a struggle of hope against hope.
Watch this space. Morning Report, weekdays from 6, on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland, Auckland, Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty, also western areas from Waikato to Kapiti Coast, including central high country. Mainly fine weather, some cloud tomorrow evening south of Taranaki. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, cloudy periods with isolated showers in Gisborne and the Wairoa district, mainly fine farther south and becoming fine throughout tomorrow morning. Wellington and Wairarapa, cloudy periods tonight, fine tomorrow, apart from evening cloud in Wellington. Nelson and Marlborough, cloudy areas, especially near the coast, becoming mainly fine tomorrow. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, fine weather. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, cloudy periods about Westland and Bulla, but fine in Fiordland at first. Becoming cloudy throughout tonight. Tomorrow, cloudy morning and evening with patchy drizzle in Westland. Patchy drizzle also in Fiordland at night. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods, 1 or 2 showers tonight. Becoming fine tomorrow afternoon. RNZ National, it's 7.5 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Queenstown tourist operators need an exact date for quarantineless travel with Australia so they can ramp back up after cutting staff and services in the wake of COVID and the closed border. That's according to a local industry group. The Prime Minister's announced an agreement with Australia for a travel bubble in the first quarter of next year, assuming there's no material changes in either country's COVID status. And the exact date for rolling out the welcome mat is yet to be decided. Australia's cabinet still needs to sign off. Arrangements are being made to keep arriving Aussies separate from other passengers, and airlines need notice to fire back up grounded planes and furloughed staff. Craig Douglas from the Queenstown Chamber of Commerce says it's the best news they've had in yonks, but they're going to need a run-up too.
Well, it's great to hear that, we're talking about first quarter of next year. The sooner the better for the visitor industry in New Zealand.
So is it an early Christmas present or is it a late Christmas present as far as you're concerned?
I suppose it's the hint of a Christmas present. Really, there's a lot of water to go under the bridge yet to understand what that actually means for people being able to travel. And, the businesses need more certainty around the timeframes that we're talking about from an announcement to the reality of it actually occurring. What are the logistics that are going to be required for people to be able to travel? The industry needs time to react and respond and make sure that, we're ready to accept visitors and host them in the way that we want to be able to host them.
Are you confident it will happen in the first quarter?
Well, that's what we've got to go with. We've been told that the first quarter is what they're targeting. So confidence is a difficult thing to have at the moment. We need more certainty around a lot of issues, but this is some of the best news we've had for some time.
When you say you need more certainty and more time to prepare, what for? Because don't you have the space? You're ready, just throw open the door and go?
Well, most of the businesses have actually responded by downsizing, and there's a lot of capacity missing out of our offer here in Queenstown and across New Zealand's tourism offer generally. It doesn't come back overnight. It takes time to recruit staff. It takes time to find staff. It's very difficult at times to find the right staff. And then they've got to be trained. Businesses have got to be provisioned. It's not something that businesses can immediately turn on volume. They need time to be able to respond and react.
So are some of them also working reduced hours?
Very much so. Reduced hours, reduced offer, very much about keeping the staff costs as low as possible because the revenues just aren't there at the moment with the volume that's coming through. So it's one thing to say that we're going to have plane loads of Australians turning up and want to experience everything that we've got on offer, but it's going to take time for the industry to be able to switch all of that back on. And rather than respond after the fact, what we would be calling for is to know well in advance so that people can prepare and be ready as soon as the opportunity presents itself.
So what information do you need besides an exact date?
It's really the notice period. How much forward notice will we get of the date? When people start arriving, are there going to be any logistical requirements? Are people going to have to test? Are their movements going to be restricted? What's expected as far as people sort of logging their movements around the country? There's a lot of questions that will be answered, I'm sure, but what we call for is for them to be answered sooner rather than later so that people can prepare.
If they are talking about free travel by the end of the first quarter, when do you need to know the exact date? How much of a run-up do you need?
It's difficult to say, but it's 6 weeks would probably be a good target to know that you can prepare, organise your business, get the appropriate staff employed, and that's going to be a challenge because in the tourism industry, there's a lot of migrant staff that are no longer here that form a lot of the resource pool that businesses use to deliver volume. We need some weeks to respond.
Will there be businesses that simply cannot make it until that time?
I think it will be difficult for some. The certainty of knowing that it will happen at a particular time will make it easier for businesses to plan to make it through to then. The difficulty that many have at the moment is that they're trying to stretch their meagre resources through to a period when they can trade at a profitable level again, but nobody can tell them when that's going to be. So again, certainty about that will give businesses the ability to make the decisions that they need to make sure that they can get through.
What percentage of businesses in your area do you think are not profitable without foreign tourists?
Oh, look, I don't know if I can put a figure on that. There are several businesses and many businesses that won't be profitable. There are many businesses that are trading through on the back of their capital at the moment just to keep going because they can see the opportunity that they will be profitable again. And again, it's that uncertainty of knowing what that window of time will be. So it's difficult for them to know if it's worth continuing or they might as well shut up shop now because they're not going to make it through to when visitors arrive back. But if we knew when that was, then they could make much more informed decisions. But the Australian market is second to our domestic market, particularly in summer. They're a very strong contributor to Queenstown. And of course, if we do have an open border with Australia, it's unlikely that Australians will be able to travel to anywhere but New Zealand. So, we're going to be a very sought-after destination for Australians who are wanting to travel.
And that is Craig Douglas from the Queenstown Chamber of Commerce. A surprise visit has revealed a prison designed to help rehabilitate prisoners is instead keeping them locked down for up to 23 hours a day with little access to education and rehab programs. A report by the Chief Ombudsman into Auckland prison has found 2 breaches of the UN Convention Against Torture and cruel and degrading treatment, with an inmate being pepper sprayed even after he followed a guard's orders. Other failings at our only maximum security jail include high levels of assault, including sexual attacks, resulting in a number of prisoners requesting voluntary segregation to avoid bullying, standover tactics and gang clashes. Unacceptable ventilation and staff shortages are resulting in inmates missing out on medical appointments, parole and reintegration appointments. Well, joining me now is the Chief Ombudsman, Judge Peter Bosher. It makes for grim reading in part. How would you describe your findings? How bad is it?
It's a disappointing report, Lisa, and a disappointing situation. Look, we all know of the old Peremu. That prison had been around for a long time. This new $280 million facility, opened in 2018, was to be the dream for the future. This was to be the prison that dealt with New Zealand's hard criminals in order to try and rehabilitate. It's sadly not doing it. It really is just containing and not really achieving the goals it was set out for. So big challenges ahead, strong leadership needed.
So why hasn't the culture of the prison changed?
I think you can look to COVID-19 and lockdown as the start of prison guards' availability being reduced and a bigger lockdown regime being introduced because that was practical and pragmatic. Unfortunately, I think that's just continued. So what we found, I'll give you an example. In the high security unit, this is not even the most maximum. The prisoners there are locked up at 3 p.m. They have their meal at about 2:30 p.m. They're locked up from 3 p.m. until the following morning at about 8 a.m. You'll see that the chances of rehabilitation and reintegration are just so minimal when you're in your cell on your own for that period of time. We really need some strong leadership at the top.
There is a list of issues raised in this report, and I want to get through a considerable chunk of them. Assault rates, 35%. Sexual assault rates, 13%. How has this been allowed to happen?
The answer is, I don't know. I sense that one of the answers to increasing containment and inability of prisoners to mix with others, because the prison can't seem to allow prisoners to mix in a safe setting. It's true that two factors may have contributed, Lisa. One is staff shortages. The other is that the staff is all fairly new. Many have experienced less than 2 years in the job. It's only after a period of time, I would suggest, as a prison officer, that you learn how to manage and how to do it in a holistic way. I just think the prison has got some way to go before it's equipped to do this.
That can't be acceptable, though, in terms of the collateral damage to end up with 13% of inmates being sexually assaulted.
Well, it's the very reason that you hope you wouldn't send someone to prison for, and that is to make them worse. So I agree with you. And let's remember, it's worth restating that I'm talking to you in my capacity as Parliament's designated monitor of prisons to ensure that minimum standards are adhered to. It's an international covenant as well as a New Zealand domestic statute. We are not achieving what we are meant to in terms of our obligations. That's why I'm being fairly clear in my criticism.
I am interested in an incident which involved a pepper spraying of a prisoner. Can you just describe to me briefly the details in which this person was pepper sprayed? Obviously, they had an incident in their cell. They triggered the sprinkler system. But at the point this inmate was pepper sprayed, what was he doing?
Right. The prisoner concerned commented to my inspectors at the time that he had been pepper sprayed. They asked to see the footage. The footage showed that the prisoner had tampered with the sprinkler and retreated to the rear of his cell. The prison officers went into the cell. This is all from the footage. They demanded, as they were entitled to do, for him to comply. They said, get down on your hands and get down on your knees. Put your hands behind your back. The footage showed the prisoner kneeling compliantly, putting his hands behind his head. He was then pepper sprayed. The prison officers wrote up a report on this and understated and minimalised what had happened. When my inspectors compared the footage they'd seen with what the prison staff had written up, the two did not reconcile. So there are two aspects about this. One was, on the face of it, the pepper spraying was gratuitous. The second was that the reporting was inadequate and unacceptable.
Isn't that a cover-up?
It's never acceptable when you depart from the truth. And one of the reasons I insist on accuracy myself is credibility. And that's the problem that prison staff will have. As far as I'm concerned, you establish credibility by being honest and transparent. It's non-negotiable.
But Judge, a departure from the truth in this instance is lies, isn't it? They told lies to give a different representation of something that they had been involved in when they acted inappropriately. By anyone's measure, is that not a cover-up?
Well, lies is a motive. Look, I would prefer you to form your own conclusion and your listeners too. I've given you the clinical explanation of what happened. The end result is not a pretty one.
Which leads us to the body cameras not being turned on at the start of incidents generally. Given the incident that you have just described in clinical terms to us, how much of a concern is it that prison officers are not turning their body cameras on at the start of incidents, and why do you think that would be?
If you look at just what changes have occurred, say, in the United States that we've seen since body cameras are being used, and the change in what we now see as actually happening with before what was represented as a story, we know how important body cameras are. I would like to see it routine that when a prison officer is beginning an interaction with a prisoner, the camera is turned on so that the important beginning part of it is captured. Let's hope that the use of body cameras in this setting becomes routine and unexceptional.
Do they not want a record of their actions?
Well, that's the question that you have to ask. And there are instances, aren't there, where someone claims something, and when you look at the footage, there's a different perception altogether. One person's perception of what they've done, for whatever reason, maybe their anxiety at consequence could lead them to minimalise what they did. I think the importance of cameras is accountability.
I note that your investigators had difficulty talking to a number of prisoners in the maximum security wing. They were forced to try and talk to them through food hatches. Again, given what you have laid out, do you think corrections were not keen on you speaking freely to prisoners?
The real problem, well, can I answer it in this way? It's consequence of not having enough staff and early lockdown. When, for instance, on my trip, on the 1st of December, I spoke to a number of prisoners. I had to do that in some cases through their prison doors because by 4 o'clock when I was there, they had been locked down for already an hour. So whether it was an intentional distancing of the prisoner from my inspectors, I don't know. I would probably prefer it that the periods of containment in the cell are now so long it's difficult to get easy access.
Why are some prisoners in directed segregation, isolation in essence, for these extended stays? I think there was one prisoner, more than 400 days and no proper paperwork recording these durations.
Lisa, this is frankly one of my biggest concerns. I talked to 2 prisoners in Unit 10. They're not meant to be there in assessment for much of a long time. There's meant to be a process of working out for how long they need to be there and a plan. At least one of the men I spoke to had been in the situation for 18 months. I can't see how one is going to try and normalise a prisoner in that setting when you are in that artificial and pretty oppressive situation for all of that time. I really would like to think that, can we just talk about the prison scene? When 2 or 3 years ago the prison muster was 10,800, you could see that because of churn it was really difficult. It's now reduced to 8,300. I'd like to feel with that less pressure, there is the ability of prison officers to spend more time with prisoners and to enable their planning to occur in a more meaningful fashion.
Appreciate you joining us this evening. That is the Chief Ombudsman, Judge Peter Bosher there, talking about, a report that stemmed from a surprise visit to our only maximum security prison, that's Auckland Prison, and 37 recommendations have come out of that report. It is 25 minutes past 5, and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm keen for your feedback on that. The judge saying there that a number of prisoners were locked down for 23 hours a day, and that does not allow for rehabilitation and education, which is what the prison system is trying to achieve. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. The Prime Minister is refusing to be drawn on whether a deal over Ihumatao was given the green light in the last Cabinet meeting for the year. RNZ understands an agreement for Fletchers to sell the disputed land to the government was put before ministers in an attempt to break the long-running deadlock. But the opposition is crying foul, saying Jacinda Ardern helped create the mess and taxpayers should not have to bail her out. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
While Cabinet Ministers met in the Beehive for the final meeting of 2020, at Ihumatao the crowds of protesters have gone. Kiani Matarasipu from the group Save Our Unique Landscape and Makoto Marae says life carries on, regardless of the decisions being made in Wellington.
So there are kaitiaki still on the whenua, and they are our whānau. So some of them are living up there, some of them are going up for days or going up for evenings and staying in some of the spaces that have been weatherproofed up there, which is the pallet castles, as people sort of refer to them now. But they are just weatherproofed spaces. People are living their everyday lives.
She says it's already taken a long time and they look forward to progress being made under whatever timeline.
We're always hopeful, we always have hope. We've got this far, it's been 5 and a bit years now, and I think What we've learnt over the years is that you never hold your breath. You kind of just let the process play out as it needs to, and that's sort of what's happening at the moment.
It's understood the proposed deal involves the sale of the land to the government, with agreement from all parties to the dispute, including mana whenua, after months of negotiations. But the Prime Minister was giving nothing away in her post-Cabinet media briefing.
As per my usual practice, when we have any announceables from Cabinet, we'll be making announcements on those at the appropriate time.
Attempts by Labour Party ministers to get a Cabinet-mandated resolution were repeatedly blocked last term by coalition partner New Zealand First, which is no longer in Parliament or around the Cabinet table. Again, no specific comment on that from Ms Ardern.
Throughout that entire year, with or without different government arrangements, it's always been our desire to find a resolution to this issue. That hasn't changed.
Are you saying it didn't go to Cabinet today?
No, I'm not giving you any confirmation of what was on the Cabinet agenda today.
National leader Judith Collins says Ms Ardern should explain why she thinks it's appropriate to meddle in private property rights with taxpayers' money.
We've got 480 houses that should have been built by now on that site. We have a private contract that has now been interfered with, and we've had protesters feeling that they are able to go and live on a site that they do not own or have no rights to.
And she warns the government will open a Pandora's box if it spends any taxpayer money on the land, placing a question mark over all full and final treaty settlements.
Once you start opening the treaty settlements after they've been settled, I think it's a very dangerous precedent.
ACT leader David Seymour also concerned about the principle of property rights in New Zealand.
The Prime Minister is showing the dangerous side of kindness by sending the message, if you squat on somebody else's property, the Prime Minister won't uphold their property rights. The government might even use taxpayer money to buy the property for you.
Ms Ardern says not setting a precedent is a key principle for the government.
We've been very specific that one of the criteria for any resolution at Ihumatao has to be that it doesn't undermine the treaty process.
One of the criticisms of Ms Ardern after she promised there'd be no development until the dispute was resolved was she'd never visited the site. But now she's taking advice.
Kingitanga, they've played an incredible role in bringing together mana whenua to try and progress a solution that meets their needs. That work continues. But I have equally leaned very heavily on the advice of Kingitanga on everything, including, for instance, when would be appropriate eventually in the future to visit.
Kiani Matata-Sipu from Seoul says if Cabinet has agreed to buy the land from Fletchers, there would still be a long way to go.
Even if there is a resolution before Christmas, it is still part of an ongoing process, so the resolution doesn't mean it's the end of anything either.
Ms Ardern would give no details about when an announcement would be made, but the pressure's on for the government to have something in the bag when she and senior ministers attend the big political events that kick off the year, Ratana and Waitangi, where the emphasis is on what the government has achieved for Māori. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
With hundreds cramped in temporary housing, the opening of dozens of new state homes in Porirua is being described as an important milestone. The 29 new 1- and 2-bedroom units were blessed this morning with more than 50 dwellings in the city north of Wellington due for completion early next year. But the city's mayor says demand for state housing is overwhelming as she took a swipe at the government over the speed and investment in the project. Reporter Hamish Cardwell and videographer Dom Thomas went to the blessing and filed this report.
A blessing on a warm summer morning for a region in desperate need of more warm, dry homes. Rents in the city are through the roof and house prices soaring. Will Pennington from Crown State Housing Agency Kāinga Ora Porirua says the homes are a welcome Christmas gift for tenants in the economically deprived Cannons Creek suburb.
And this morning we have a further 29 brand new, double glazed, carpeted, warm, healthy homes for tenants to move in before Christmas, which we're very pleased and we're very proud to be here today to open.
Richard Wasley from construction firm Jenny & Homes, which built the houses, says the pandemic caused some problems, but they soldiered on.
Obviously the COVID situation wasn't ideal, put the brakes on things for a bit, but no, I think in terms of bouncing back from that, supplying and all that sort of carried on as per usual, and things were a bit slower when we're in level 2.
The houses joined 10 opened earlier in the year and are part of the government's $1.5 billion investment in housing in eastern Porirua. It plans to build 2,000 Kiwi-built homes, 150 state homes, and refurbish nearly 3,000 state homes over the next 2.5 decades. Kāinga Ora Regional Director Greg Grofsky trumpeted the building program.
This is more homes than New Zealand's been seen delivered in literally decades. Not since the 1950s or 60s have we seen homes delivered in those volumes. It's a start, we've got a long way to go.
Kāinga Ora is working with the iwi Ngāti Toa Rangatira and Porirua City Council. Porirua Mayor Anita Baker says it's fabulous the new homes are finished, but the government broke its promise to deliver hundreds of new dwellings a year to the city. Meanwhile, she says hundreds are forced to live in hotels and motels, many with whole families crushed into a single room, waiting for long-term accommodation.
Originally we were promised 200 a year to start with, and we're not getting that. We've got every motel in Porirua except one full of social housing. So we have about 650 people on the wait list. So I want more per year than what they're delivering. We need to do it faster. We've got the infrastructure to deal with government, but I'd like more houses on the ground and I'd like it a lot quicker.
Anita Baker wants the government to cough up more money to build infrastructure for the developments. The original state houses at the site were demolished in the late 2010s, and the empty lots have seen protests calling for a kickstart to state house construction. Labour Party electorate MP Barbara Edmonds agrees it's taken too long.
But it's also just an indication of years of underbuilding. So, we're trying to catch up on 30 years of a problem. So we're really fortunate this is a start, and 50 homes in 1 year is excellent.
The government says it's building or funding more than 18,000 new public and transitional homes by 2024. For Checkpoint, i te whanganui atara, ko Hamish Cardwell aho.
And coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, ministers are taken to court over what a claimant calls a ludicrous and absurd disability care issue. The vaccine rollout gets underway in the US, and the changes the Blood Service is making to the way it screens donors for the risk of HIV. We would love your feedback. Let us know what you think of the report into our toughest jail, Auckland prison. 13% of prisoners there are reporting sexual abuse, incidents of cruelty as defined by the Ombudsman, and guards misrepresenting their actions. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time now for the 5:35 headlines.
The border between New Zealand and Australia is scheduled to be reopened for travel by March next year. The announcement's been made by the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern after today's Cabinet meeting. Quarantine-free travel will also require Australian government approval and COVID case numbers staying at rock bottom. Craig Douglas from the Queenstown Chamber of Commerce says the news is great, but he's told Checkpoint it's one thing to say plane loads of tourists are coming, but another thing to switch the tourism industry back on. He says towns like his need to know well in advance when the borders will be reopened to Australians and what sort of logistical requirements will be needed to monitor the tourists. And we've just heard that the Deputy Chief Executive of Oranga Tamariki, Hoani Lambert, has resigned. This has been confirmed by the Chief Executive, and we will have more on the story later in Checkpoint. Mana whenua at Ihumatao are hoping a resolution can finally be reached in the long-running land dispute. RNZ understands an agreement has been reached in a first step towards resolving the standoff over a proposed housing development on the historic Auckland site. Kiani Matata Sipu from the group Save Our Unique Landscape and Makoto Marae says there's been talk of a deal being reached before, but this time she's more hopeful. The first court appearance for the 13 parties facing charges over alleged health and safety breaches in the lead-up to last year's Whakaari eruption has been adjourned. All of those charged by WorkSafe were due in Auckland District Court tomorrow. However, the case has been put off until March next year. A report into the country's only maximum security prison reveals a myriad of problems and shows it is failing on promises to boost rehabilitation. The Chief Ombudsman, Peter Bosher, inspected Mount Eden Prison in Auckland unannounced and found prisoners were being locked in their cells for up to 23 hours a day despite new units opening to aid rehabilitation. He's made dozens of recommendations. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. It's time now to get to the business news with Nicholas Poynton. Nicholas, Mike Perot, the sort of real estate guy, is delving into other things.
Yeah, probably best known for Mike Perot Mortgages. Earlier this year we saw reports that he's exited that business, although the company still does bear his name, to turn his attention to the skies, but probably in particular the Cook Islands, really, because today he put out a press release outlining his plan to launch a new airline known as Pacifica Air, which will fly direct routes to Rarotonga from Wellington and Christchurch. And this has been in the works for some time that we've heard in the past. He's been a big advocate for one of these Cook Islands travel bubbles, and when that was announced last week, this is why we're seeing this story today. And the airline is waiting for approval from the Civil Aviation Authority, but once it does get that green light, it will commence 3 flights a week from June. And I spoke to Mike today, and he told me that right now is actually the best time to launch an airline. He's saying that because of the disruption and the downturn in the industry, it means entry into the market is actually really cheap. He says the terms, to lease a plane, so they're going to lease 2 planes. It's actually never been cheaper to lease 2 planes. He says aviation fuel is cheaper. And what we're seeing in the aviation industry is lots of international airlines actually shrink their operation. The great piece of jargon they use is they talk about right-sizing their operations. So a lot of airlines are focusing...
That is a special piece of jargon, right-sizing.
A lot of airlines are talking about focusing on their domestic operations, and he believes that this means there'll be less competition in the international market. He believes there is demand for overseas travel, and his airline, which will give people direct access to the Cook Islands, is going to be a winner. He says currently if you live in the South Island, you have to take 2 flights to get there. With his airline, you'll be able to just fly there direct. And I see you making a bit of a face there.
No, I'm just really curious. So he says the planes are going to be the cheapest that they could be to lease. So what about staff, pilots and what have you? Obviously there was a lot of layoffs. Has he mentioned where he's getting those people from?
Great question, yes. So I asked him about this and he didn't really want to say. He talked about how they've got experience on their side, but I asked him, look, there's been an exodus of senior executives, of plenty of staff from Air New Zealand, but he sort of refused to comment about where those people would be coming from. He said they'll be giving more details and announcements in the new year. But I also put to him that this country has been a graveyard for small airlines over the years who've said that they're going to come to this country, they're going to enter the market, they're going to shake things up. And but when I asked him, what are you going to do differently? And he says, for starters, they're going to do what they didn't. And he says that this company is going to be well capitalised. They have the experience. Their timing for entry into the market couldn't be better. They have the aircraft available. And look, this is going to be a really exciting space to see how this materialises once they get that green light, because a lot of this, what they're gambling on, is that there's going to be significant demand from New Zealanders to go to the Cook Islands. So let's just see if that really plays out in the end.
One to watch. Quickly, can we talk about the services sector and activity in there running into congestion?
Yeah, the services sector slipped back into contraction for the first time in 6 months, really. It's the lowest that activity has been. Got the latest read off the sector from the BNZ Bank. It shows that, like I mentioned before, yes, the whole sector is actually in contraction, and the reason why we've seen a bit of a real step backwards from October to November is weak sales, supply chain challenges and falling stocks. But it's really those supply chain challenges that have been the real kicker, a real pain point for the industry. That sub-index was in its 30s, which is deep in contraction territory, and it's the small firms that are struggling the most to get their small goods into the country, to get those products in the door so they can actually sell them to people. One of the other things that's probably a bit concerning, and this has been a real lingering problem in the sector, is that employment intentions have been weak. The indicators have been showing that jobs have been shed in the sector for the past 9 consecutive months. And look, when I spoke to the bank's senior economist, I said, what's going to turn this around? And he said, there's no real silver bullet with those closed borders, the loss of international tourism. It's not just the foreign money coming into this country, it's also the foreign workers, backpackers who come into this country, work in bars and cafes or take retail jobs for sort of extended periods at a time. And unfortunately, with the summer coming up, these issues are really going to be magnified. So sort of a down note to finish on, but hopefully we can see some pickup or some tailwinds in the new year.
Let's take a quick gallop around the markets.
Well, yeah, worth mentioning that opening of trading today was delayed by tech glitches. The market finally opened at 11:30, and the NZX finished down 84 points to 12,835. Our dollar is at 70.8 US cents, 94 Australian and 53.2 British pence.
Thanks, Nicholas. Nicholas Poynton there with business. In breaking news, the Deputy Chief Executive of Oranga Tamariki, Hoani Lambert, has resigned. Chief Executive of the agency, Gronya Moss, has just confirmed the news at a media conference in Wellington. Our Māori News Director, Mani Dunlop, was there and joins me now. Mani, bring us up to date. What's happened?
Kia ora, yes. So she's just announced that Hoani Lambert, who was, as you said, the DCE and Voices of Children at OT, and has been leading a lot of the work that OT has been doing in terms of those iwi partnerships. So he has resigned. He's going to DIA, Department of Internal Affairs, and he's been replaced by Darren Haimona, who is from Ngāti Haua. So that's the latest that we have here after she was grilled extensively at the Waitangi Tribunal OT inquiry here in Wellington.
So, Mani, how does what she told reporters at the press conference marry up with what she was asked at the tribunal hearing and the answers that she gave there?
Look, it was a bit of a stark contrast from when she previously appeared in late November, where she was making concessions around structural racism. Today, in the hearing, she was asked in November by Judge Dugan to come back and answer some questions that the panel did have for her. And she kept on referring to, I guess, the levers in society that can address structural racism. And it did feel like a bit of a wind back from those initial concessions. Although, when she was questioned on that in the media conference, she denied that and said, the concessions were bold and were brave, and that they are doing a lot of work in this space. She was also questioned quite a lot around, whether or not the public has confidence in her and whether or not she thinks that they do. She seemed to think that they do, that she is committed to the job. She, although the Minister of Children, Carmen Davis, has yet not expressed his full confidence or confidence at all in Gronya Moss, she said that she's having ongoing and constructive conversations with the Minister, and that was as of early as this morning.
So did she give any reasons for Hoani Lambert's resignation?
No, Lisa, I did push her. I did ask whether or not this means that she is losing confidence from her senior leadership team. She said no, that wasn't the case at all, that he had another job and that's what he was going to. I asked her again whether or not she can be confident in leading some of, obviously, Section 7AA and some of the what a lot of these reviews have been calling on transformative change and also looking at the devolution of power from OT to Māori. She believes that they are in a position with the replacement, Darren Haimona, to continue that mahi, despite Hoani Lambert being one of those who was very key in a lot of that work.
Thanks, Mani. That is Mani Dunlop, our Māori News Director, who's just been at that press conference with Gronya Moss, the head of Oranga Tamariki. And just to recap there, Hoani Lambert has resigned. He's the Deputy Chief Executive of Oranga Tamariki. And Checkpoint's spoken to Hoani Lambert. He says he is fully supportive of Gronya Moss in her role as the Chief Executive there. Government ministers are being taken to the employment court over what a claimant calls a ludicrous and absurd disability care issue. The case is around legislation which means people with disabilities who need care are legally required to be the employers of their family caregivers. It means in some cases people with severe mental disabilities and the mental age of a preschooler are the employers of their parents. John Bond was in the employment court in Auckland.
The lawyer leading the case, Paul Dale QC, says the legislation around family care is about as difficult as it could be and ultimately must change.
And we can say that the policies are discriminatory, that they are unworkable, and we can say that they are unlawful because they distinguish between those who are in employment but are family members and those who provide care and are paid for.
He says the funded family care system is riddled with issues, including arbitrarily treating family carers differently to external carers for doing the same job.
This issue of funded family care for the disabled and the family support provided is a sorry blight on our legislative history.
In addition to the employment arrangements is how much work the carers are paid for. This case centres on a woman called Christine Fleming and the care she provides for her son Justin. He needs full-time care with an adult on hand 24 hours a day. However, the system decided he needed just 22 hours care a week, meaning that's all Christine, his primary carer, could be paid for.
Miss Fleming ends up with 22 hours. It's just absurd. There's no other way of putting it.
Then there's having to navigate the system, as lawyer Mark Jeffries explains.
It's very complex. It's highly rule-bound and prescriptive. And at each layer of the implementation of funding for resident family caregivers, there are a plethora of rules, processes, policies. It is a labyrinth.
Christine Fleming wants the court to decide whether her son, as a disabled person, can be her employer, and if not, who is. The defendants are the Ministers of Health, Social Development and Disability, with lawyers for the Attorney-General appearing on behalf of them. The case before Chief Employment Court Judge Christine Ingalls is set down for 5 days. I tamaki makoto for Checkpoint, ko Jordan Bond, tēnei.
The Pacific Islands Forum is calling on Australia not to let its neighbours sink due to the impacts of climate change. The call was made at the Forum Leaders Summit on the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement and ahead of UN-brokered talks on the issue. Addressing the virtual meeting, Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison emphasised Canberra's commitment to abandon its plan to use Kyoto Protocol carryover credits to meet its Paris Pact targets. But as Christine Ravoy reports, as the region's biggest gas emitter, Australia has declined a timeline on reaching net zero emissions.
I refuse to let Fijians and our Pacific Island sisters and brothers be some sacrificial canary for coal-burning countries and high-emitting companies. We must not stand idly by and watch the world's most vulnerable countries suffer, only to warn other wealthier nations that their own fate will soon follow. This is not just Fiji's climate emergency, it is the world's emergency.
There were strong words from Fiji's Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama, who is insisting Australia sets a target for net zero emissions by 2050. Scott Morrison told the summit Australia will not be needing to use the Kyoto credits to reach emissions targets. But Mr. Bainimarama said while he welcomes Australia's move, he is urging more ambitious action from the region's key partner. Forum Chair and Tuvalu Prime Minister Kausia Natano says climate change is the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security and well-being of the peoples of the region.
5 years on, we must now ask ourselves, are we making the necessary policy and behavioral change to keep us on the 1.5 degree pathway? From the perspective of the Blue Pacific, the answer is simple. No, we are not.
2 weeks after New Zealand declared a climate change emergency, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says the Pacific should expect more from her government.
In May next year, our Climate Commission will make recommendations to us around the compatibility of our NDCs with the 1.5 degree temperature limit that we have established in our domestic legislation.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres agrees with the Pacific leaders and called on all countries to declare a climate emergency until carbon neutrality is reached.
Carbon dioxide levels are at record highs. Today we are 1.2 degrees hotter than before the Industrial Revolution. If we don't change course, we may be headed for a catastrophic temperature rise of more than 3 degrees this century.
Meanwhile, the UN has awarded its Champion of the Earth award to the Fijian leader, Frank Bainimarama, who says the recognition is for every Fijian, every Pacific Islander, and every person on Earth whose lives had been impacted, uprooted, or even lost because of the impacts of climate change. The award is the UN's highest environmental honour, which recognises outstanding leaders from governments, civil societies, and the private sector. For Checkpoint, ko Christine Ravoy, Aho.
It's 9 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Do get in touch about anything you hear on the programme this evening. Text us 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. The Blood Service has made sweeping changes to the way it screens potential donors for the risk of HIV, bringing us in line with a number of overseas countries. Effective immediately, men who have sex with men can now give blood after abstaining from oral or anal sex for 3 months, rather than the previous 12-month stand-down. Anyone taking HIV prevention medication can't give blood until they've been off the drugs for 3 months. People who've previously lived in a country with high HIV levels can now give blood after 3 months instead of 12, and that stand-down period for sex workers or anyone who has accepted payment for sex has also been reduced to 3 months. Joining me now to discuss the changes is Dr. Peter Flanagan from the New Zealand Blood Service. Kia ora, Doctor. Why have these changes come about now?
Well, 6 years ago, when we introduced a 12-month deferral, we also committed to monitor the environment and to make further changes as and when sufficient evidence came to light to demonstrate that it would be safe to do so. 2 years ago, the United Kingdom introduced a 3-month deferral for the set of criteria that you've outlined, and we now have sufficient data from their experience linked in with information from other countries to be confident that we can safely make the change whilst ensuring that New Zealand's blood supply maintains its high reputation for safety.
So men who have sex with men, they have to abstain or have not had oral or anal sex for 3 months in order to give blood, even if they use a condom. Why is that?
Well, we know that in the very early stages of infection that our tests, though the best available, may not detect the virus, and therefore there is a small risk that HIV could be transmitted to the recipient of a transfusion. Our primary responsibility is to assure safety. Now, the issue with condoms is condoms are highly effective at reducing sexual transmission, but they're not 100% perfect. And because there is a small risk associated with condom failure, New Zealand Blood Service, in line with most other international blood services, does not accept that condom use per se is sufficient to remove the requirement for the deferral period.
So is that a decision entirely based on science, or is there a degree of prejudice in that?
Well, I believe it's based on science.
So also on international evidence, is how much of an increased risk is there with these shortened stand-down periods, if any?
Well, we believe that the data that has accrued over the last few years demonstrates that as we've progressively reduced the deferral period, and remember in 2008 it was 10 years, so over the 12-year period it's gone from 10 years to 3 months. And the evidence indicates that that change has not impacted adversely on the overall safety of the blood supply, and that gives us confidence that continuing to reduce the period of deferral will assure the level of safety whilst hopefully allowing greater levels of participation from groups who are affected by the criteria.
So countries that have high risk of HIV, people coming from those countries, regardless of their sexual status, they, stand down for 3 months before they're able to give blood as well?
Indeed, we've always identified that our aim is to look at the pattern of HIV infection in New Zealand and to put measures in place that will ensure that all risk categories are appropriately affected.
So which countries, sorry to interrupt, Doctor, but which countries remain on that high-risk list then?
Well, we use the same list that the Department of Immigration used to define high-risk status for HIV. Essentially, it's predominantly sub-Saharan Africa, but there are also some countries in Asia which will fall under the list. A full list is available on our website.
Okay. And if we can look at the donors, potential donors who are paid for sex, so potentially sex workers and others, they have a stand-down period of 3 months before they correct. Can give blood. Now, that's down from a previous 12 months.
Yes.
What is the risk there with being paid for sex and potential HIV risk?
Well, these criteria address not only risks associated with HIV, but also with a range of other viruses, particularly hepatitis B and hepatitis C. And what we know is that in some countries around the world, sex workers are at increased risk of carrying the range of bloodborne viruses of concern, and therefore we have a 3-month period in place for deferral.
But is that the same in New Zealand? Are sex workers at higher risks, or is there any evidence that they have higher rates of these infections?
This was looked at in some of the independent expert reviews some years ago, and we began to reduce the deferral periods at that point. At this stage, yes, there is an increased risk, although that risk is not necessarily great. We do, however, need to bear in mind that the criteria apply not only to sex workers in New Zealand, but people who've had sex with sex workers overseas and people who've worked as sex workers overseas. And most certainly internationally, there is a high correlation with increased HIV risk in those settings.
How old is the data in relation to sex workers?
Sex workers in New Zealand or from overseas?
In New Zealand that you're relying on in terms of infection rates.
The data that we're relying on is the data that's produced on an annual basis by the AIDS Epidemiology Unit at the University of Otago. And they've been party to the discussions we've had around making the changes. So, I emphasise again, the risk of HIV with sex work in New Zealand is low, but there are other risks. And we need to remember that when we talk about sex workers, that parts of the industry are very well regulated, but there are other parts where people have accepted sex when there is a risk of prior injecting drug use and similar behaviours.
So are you relying entirely on trust in terms of these conditions?
We always rely on trust, and I'm pleased to say that I believe that those people who donate blood in New Zealand are generally very honest in terms of the information they provide to us when we screen them for suitability. Having said that, we use the combination of testing and donor criteria, and together they've been demonstrated to be far superior than relying on one or other modality alone.
Appreciate your time this evening. That is Dr. Peter Flanagan from the New Zealand Blood Service there, discussing changes that have been made to screening of potential donors for monitoring viruses and HIV with people giving blood. Some of your feedback now on the prison. This is on Auckland Prison and the report from the Ombudsman. These prison officers should be prosecuted, says Stuart, getting in touch from Otago. Someone else says the prison guards who falsified the report about the pepper spraying are falsifying a legal document. They should be charged and fired.
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leata with DNA. Australia Health Minister Greg Hunt says the federal government welcomes a New Zealand travel bubble, calling it the second half of the equation. A trans-Tasman bubble has been agreed to in principle and will be established early next year.
We're ready to implement from our side as soon as New Zealand's ready. We understand it may take a few more weeks, but we're working constructively and patiently So we'll continue to follow the medical advice.
Australia Health Minister Greg Hunt. Mr Hunt says it's the first step on a return to international normality, and an agreement would be easy to reach as some Australian states have already welcomed New Zealand travellers. Craig Douglas from the Queenstown Chamber of Commerce says the bubble is the best news the tourism industry has had for some time. However, he says businesses will need perhaps 6 weeks' notice to prepare for the arrival of Australian visitors. He says many organisations have reduced staffing and they need time to increase capacity again. Douglas says Australians' contribution to Queenstown's tourism industry is second only to New Zealanders. The Deputy Head of Oranga Tamariki, Juani Lambert, has resigned, but the Chief Executive, Gráinne Moss, will not. Ms Moss confirmed Mr Lambert's resignation at a press conference following an appearance at the Waitangi Tribunal this afternoon. She told media Mr Lambert, the top Māori leader within the organisation, will be moving to a role in the Department of Internal Affairs. Darren Haimona will become acting deputy. Ms Moss wouldn't be drawn on whether she thinks she has the confidence of the public. The Prime Minister says she's relied heavily on advice from Kingitanga throughout the Ihumatao dispute, including guidance on a good time to eventually visit the site. Jacinda Ardern's refusing to be drawn on whether a deal was rubber-stamped at today's Cabinet meeting, the last for the year. RNZ understands there's agreement from all parties for Fletchers to sell the disputed land to the government, but that has to go through Cabinet. Ms Ardern says Kingitanga has done an excellent job bringing mana whenua together and into the discussions.
And that work continues. But I have equally leaned very heavily on the advice of Kingitanga on everything, including, for instance, when would be appropriate eventually in the future to visit.
Jacinda Ardern. Nationals crying foul, saying the Prime Minister helped create the mess and taxpayers shouldn't have to bail her out. A report into the country's only maximum security prison reveals a myriad of problems and shows it is failing on promises to boost rehabilitation. The report stems from an unannounced visit to Auckland prison at Paremoremo by the Chief Ombudsman. He found prisoners were being locked in cells for up to 23 hours a day and breaches of the UN Convention Against Torture, such as a prisoner being pepper sprayed although they were following instructions. Peter Bosher told Checkpoint this is despite new units opening to aid rehabilitation.
They have their meal at about 2:30 p.m. They're locked up from 3 p.m. until the following morning at about 8 a.m. You'll see that the chances of rehabilitation and reintegration are just so minimal when you're in your cell on your own for that period of time. We really need some strong leadership at the top.
Peter Bosher. The first court appearance for the 13 parties facing charges over health and safety breaches in the lead-up to last year's Whakaari eruption has been adjourned until March next year. All of those charged by WorkSafe were due in Auckland District Court tomorrow. The charges do not relate to the rescue operation launched in the aftermath of the eruption and only to events prior to it. Those charged include the owners of the island, Whakaari Management Limited, and companies that took tourists to the island. Tonga is set to be hit by one of the first two cyclones of the season tonight. Cyclone Zazu formed this afternoon and is heading towards the northern islands of Vava'u, while a second cyclone, Yasa, sits in the waters between Vanuatu and Fiji, gathering strength. Koro Vakauta reports.
Cyclone Zazu emerged this afternoon, bringing inclement weather to the north of Tonga. It's expected to lie about 45 kilometres west-northwest of Vava'u around 9 p.m. tonight, bringing winds of up to 70 kilometres an hour, thunderstorms and high seas to the island group. Meanwhile, Cyclone Yas is currently a Category 1 storm with at least 65 kilometre an hour winds, but is expected to intensify into a Category 4 system with more than 160 kilometre winds by Wednesday. It's then expected to move southeast and impact eastern parts of Fiji. Ko koro vakauta tēnei.
It's coming up to 5 minutes past 6. The New Zealand cricketers say Test rankings and the Test Championship final are not something they're talking about. The Black Caps' innings and 12-run win over the West Indies in Wellington today has moved them top equal in the Test rankings with Australia, while they rise to third in the Test Championship. The top teams in the Test Championship will meet in a final next year. Stand-in captain Tom Latham says their focus remains on matches and series.
If we're able to keep putting in those performances each series at a time, then those results come, and we have been playing some good cricket as of late in our conditions and in a way for that matter, and it's a pretty cool thing.
Tom Latham. The Highlanders will host the Queensland Reds in Dunedin on May the 14th to kick off the 2021 Super Rugby Trans-Tasman competition. The draw has been finalised for the 5-week tournament. Rugby reporter Joe Porter has more.
The Crusaders will also be at home in round 1, hosting the Brumbies, with the Hurricanes, Blues and Chiefs heading to Australia to play the New South Wales Waratahs, Melbourne Rebels and Western Force respectively. The final between the two top-placed teams on the combined competition table is scheduled for Saturday the 19th of June. Round 3 will feature a super round with all matches being played at one venue. The location is yet to be confirmed, though there's speculation Brisbane could host the fixtures. Ko Joe Porter, Aho.
That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Carl Morn. He paints gardenscapes. Now there's a book out celebrating 3 decades of his work. Hydrangeas never looked quite so lush. Alan Dean continues his search for the internet's good side. Nick Bollinger samples some of 2020's best. And the ABC's Shannon Byrne has stories of sport played in torrid tropical heat. It's all on Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight. Tomorrow, Northland, Auckland, Coromandel Peninsula, Bay of Plenty, western areas from Waikato to Kapiti Coast and Central High Country. Mainly fine, some cloud tomorrow evening south of Taranaki. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, cloudy periods tonight with isolated showers in Gisborne, and the Wairoa district mainly fine for the south and becoming fine throughout tomorrow morning. For Wellington and Wairarapa, cloudy periods tonight, fine weather tomorrow apart from evening cloud in Wellington. Nelson and Marlborough, cloudy areas especially near the coast, becoming mainly fine tomorrow. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, fine weather. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland, cloudy periods about Westland and Bulla, but fine in Fiordland at first, becoming cloudy throughout tonight. Tomorrow, cloud morning and evening with patchy drizzle in Westland, patchy drizzle also in Fiordland at night. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods, 1 or 2 showers tonight, becoming fine tomorrow afternoon. RNZ National, it's coming up to 8 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Hoani Lambert has resigned from his role as Deputy Chief Executive of Oranga Tamariki, but he says it's not in protest at his Chief Executive. The head of Oranga Tamariki, Gronya Moss, has come under fire for her role in uplifting Māori babies from their whānau. She fronted media a short time ago after appearing before the Waitangi Tribunal, facing questions over whether her deputy resigned because of her. Hoani Lambert joins me now. Kia ora, Mr. Lambert. Why are you moving on?
I'm a professional public servant. I've been with Oranga Tamariki for 4 years. Another opportunity presented itself with the Department of Internal Affairs, and I was lucky enough to secure that role.
So what part has Gronya Moss played in your departure?
None at all. So, I was very grateful to Gronya, who gave me my first opportunity to be a Deputy Chief Executive in a government department. In that time, we've established 2 treaty units. We have begun the process of setting up strategic relationships with iwi and Māori organisations. I've also been given the privilege of establishing our first transition service, supporting young people who have spent a significant amount of their time in state care. And right across the 4 years with her, I've been very grateful to her for the opportunities that she's given me.
Is she up for the top job? Up to it?
I think she is, and I think she demonstrated that again today in the Waitangi Tribunal.
Why do you think, sorry to interrupt, why do you think she is up to the job when there have been a number of reports which seem to indicate that OT is failing miserably? Why is she the right person to lead this agency on?
So I can only talk to what I've experienced as one of the people that report to her. From the time that I started with Oranga Tamariki, I saw the nature of the challenge that was presented to us. We were essentially being asked to try and transform a system while still trying to run a system that was seriously suboptimal in the first place. What you saw in Hastings was absolutely unacceptable. However, that was the organisation that we inherited.
You mean taking Māori babies, snatching Māori baby from their whānau?
That's right, and doing that without notice, using Section 78 in a way that was not, proper for particularly whānau Māori, for any family really in New Zealand. We've learnt from that. We put in place measures immediately to make sure that there was greater scrutiny around those applications, and at the same time part of my job was to make sure that we continued with the job of transforming the system, and that is what I've been trying to do over the last 4 years. And despite the cases, the reviews, I feel that we have made some ground as an agency.
But those mistakes that you talk about, the removing Māori babies from their families without notice uplifts as they're known, they happened on Gráinne Moss's watch.
They did, but she inherited a system. She inherited a series of policies. She came in on the back of an expert advisory panel, which was accepted by the then government as being the focus, which in no way talked about Section 7AA or the treaty. The hand we were dealt when we first stood up as an agency wasn't one that was going to be easy to sort out. And in that time, Gráinne has tried her very best with her leadership team, my colleagues, to make the changes necessary.
Given that Māori and their families are overrepresented in Oranga Tamariki in terms of being in care, would it be better to have a Māori person at the head of Oranga Tamariki?
So I get asked that question a lot, and I think we need to make sure that we have leaders in the public service who are able to discharge the responsibilities of those departments. I know that Peter Hughes, the Public Service Commissioner, is focusing more and more on diversity across the public sector. We have more women.
But what do you think? What do you think? You're a Māori man in a senior position at Oranga Tamariki. You would be capable of being the boss there, wouldn't you? And all things being equal, if there is a choice of people with the same skills, should it be a Māori person that leaves Oranga Tamariki into the agency that it is supposed to become?
So I'm Māori, Gráinne's not. I don't think that I am capable of running this agency. I might be in maybe 10 years' time, but it's certainly not the role that I think that I would be able to discharge at the moment. So I think it's very much about the individual skills of the people that you're thinking about. I do like the fact that knowledge of te reo mo'ona tikanga is becoming incredibly important. I don't have the reo. I've been colonised, as a lot of Māori have, so that's a journey that I need to work on myself. But being Māori, I do think, is an important attribute, but I don't think can be the sole attribute for such an important role as this one.
Are there enough senior Māori at Oranga Tamariki?
It's hard to know what is going to be enough. I mean, we have 3 Māori on the leadership team. I know there's been some critique around our cultural capability as individuals, which, I found quite challenging. I was in the Waitangi Tribunal for 4 hours and being questioned around my knowledge of the reo, essentially being questioned as to how Māori I am. That was quite a challenging experience to go through. Probably not a great advertisement for becoming a senior public servant if you're Māori, to be quite honest, but that's the challenge that I have accepted together with a number of Māori in the public service. And it's great to see so many Māori coming through the ranks, a lot more than I saw when I started on this journey 4 years ago.
So do you think that the environment for senior Māori is hostile in the public service?
I don't think it's hostile, but I do think it's challenging. I think you're asked to walk in 2 worlds. That is the nature of the treaty partnership. All Māori in the public service have their own personal history, their hapu, their iwi of their experiences of the Crown. Some of our iwi didn't even sign the treaty. For some of us, we fought alongside Crown forces during the land confiscations, fighting the likes of Te Kooti. My marae, for instance, harboured Te Kooti and had to change our hapu name. So each public servant, Māori, brings with them their own history of colonisation, of urbanisation, and always trying to work to see how they can walk in those two worlds, and that makes me incredibly proud of my Māori colleagues in the New Zealand Public Service.
Is Oranga Tamariki doing a good job?
I think we are. We've tried very hard to...
How can you say that, though? How can you say that in the face of some very damning reports?
I can say that on the basis of the work that I have seen my team do, the relationships that they've built with iwi. We heard Tūhoi speak on the stand as part of their Waitangi Tribunal evidence about the work that they've done with us. I can't, in all honesty, speak to you, Lisa, and say that the work of my staff over the last 4 years has not been good. I think it's been excellent, but I think that shows the nature of the challenge that Oranga Tamariki has, as well as other Crown agencies, to truly transform the system so that we don't have the sorts of experiences that Māori children and Māori whānau are having today.
In terms of Gráinne Moss, does she retain your confidence? Do you have complete confidence in her ability to lead this agency?
Yes, I do, but I'll also say that I am not the employer of chief executives in the public service. At the end of the day, it's the Public Services Commissioner who has to make that determination, and my role is to fulfil my obligations to my chief executive, and that is still Gráinne Moss.
But you're at the top table, so you're witnessing things firsthand, and that's why I'm asking you. You're right in there doing this, so... does she retain your confidence from what you have seen of how she operates in Oranga Tamariki?
Yes, she does.
Are you speaking to me freely? I mean, you are, after all, going to another public service job, so I just want to get this on the record. Is this what you believe, and do you feel able to speak freely, given that you're still going to be in the employ of the government?
Yes, I do. I feel freely to be able to express my view, and that is my view.
So when is your last day going to be?
The 23rd of February, and then I start with the Department of Internal Affairs on the 1st of March.
So what level of confidence do you have in Oranga Tamariki transforming into the organisation it needs to be?
So I think the government of the day will determine the transformation that's required. I think Minister Davis has set out quite an ambitious agenda for the transformation of the organisation. We're still engaging with him around the nature of the changes in detail that he would like to see being made. The sorts of things, though, that he's talking about, particularly around the sharing of power and resources with Māori, certainly is the vision that I know in my area we've been wanting to support, and would support also the sort of capability that I've been trying to build within the organisation.
Why do you think it is that you have confidence in Gráinne Moss, but the Minister seems unable to express any confidence in her?
I'm not sure. I think that might be a question that you'd need to talk to Minister Davis about.
Are you aware of any efforts to remove Gráinne Moss from her job?
No, I'm not.
Really appreciate you speaking to me this evening. That's Hawani Lambert, who is the Deputy Chief Executive of Oranga Tamariki. And as you heard there, he has resigned from his role, but says he retains confidence in Gráinne Moss. The government has announced a package which aims to pay out Christchurch homeowners who were shortchanged by Southern Response. It's estimated about 3,000 people will be eligible for the financial package, but the government won't say how much it's going to cost. Most of them are already taking part in a class action led by Brendan and Colleen Ross and their lawyer Grant Cameron. But things are getting messy for homeowners, with another law firm launching a class action today. Sally Murphy reports.
Last year, in a landmark case, the High Court found the government's claims settlement agency, Southern Response, misled and deceived Carl and Alison Dodds when it deliberately withheld information in the detailed repair analysis for their quake-hit Canterbury home. The High Court ordered the government pay the couple nearly $180,000. The government has now set up a package for other Southern Response claimants who settled before October 2014. Minister responsible for the Earthquake Commission, David Clark, says the package will offer top-up payments to customers in a situation similar to the Dodds.
There are approximately 3,000 policyholders who settled an overcap claim with Southern Response prior to October 2014 and who may be eligible for this payment package. I'm wanting this to be resolved as soon as possible.
Mr Clark says he can't say how much it's going to cost the government. The announcement comes ahead of a looming class action led by Brendan and Colleen Ross, who are representing about 3,000 other homeowners. Minister Clark says people still have the choice of being part of the class action, but he's hopeful all cases will be settled outside of court.
Well, the class action, of course, is something that people can choose to be a part of if they want to, but what the government's aiming to do is to provide a fair package, and to do that in an upfront way. We feel that it's important that those who settled prior to October 2014 are treated equitably, and that's what this package is intended to do.
The government package will be overseen by an independent oversight committee. The Ross's lawyer for the class action, Grant Cameron, says the announcement is a step in the right direction.
Well, we're very pleased with the announcement because it means the government is now moving to a mindset whereby this matter might be ultimately settled. It's seeking directions from the court as to what it may or may not do, and that's a very positive thing.
Southern Response filed proceedings in the High Court today for permission to contact all affected parties. Mr Cameron says it's not a certainty that the government will settle cases through the package.
The government can't just decide as the defendant to go ahead with a package to settle. What it has to do is say, this is our proposal to settle, and then present that to the court. We will present our views on those issues, and then the court will decide what the proper course from going forward might be.
But in another development today, another legal firm, Meredith Connell, has launched its own class action on behalf of the estimated 3,000 homeowners. Partner Mark Davies says homeowners are getting a rough deal because the Supreme Court has made the first class action an opt-out option, meaning people could be involved without even knowing. Mr Davies says the new Canterbury homeowners class action will only take a fee of 10% compared to the 27.5% being taken by the funders of the original class action. Meredith Connell will apply to the High Court to run the class action on behalf of the policyholders. In Christchurch for Checkpoint, Sally Murphy.
It is almost 23 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. There's been another incident at a central Auckland bar involving a gun, the third in a space of a month. In the latest, the police were called after a person was seen at a bar on Sale Street with a gun on Friday night. No shots were fired and no one was injured, but bar staff had to step in to take the gun off the person, who was later arrested. That adds to two other people who are before the courts after shootings at both Dr. Rudy's on the Viaduct and Calendar Girls on Oranga Tamariki Road. Here's our reporter, Sarah Robson.
What the hell are people doing carrying guns in public places like that? And if people are carrying guns, sooner or later they're going to be used, and going to be used with fatal or damaging consequences.
That's Auckland Mayor Phil Goff. Friday night adds to two other people who are before the courts after shootings at both Dr. Rudy's on the Viaduct and Calendar Girls on Oranga Tamariki Road.
That's not the sort of Auckland we want to live in, and it's not the Auckland that we believe our city should be. We think of Chicago or New York. We don't think of Auckland when there's an incident of this nature.
Jared here from Unite Union says hospitality workers in central Auckland are increasingly confronted by violent patrons.
It is a problem. There is, if it's not direct physical violence, it is preceded with abuse, aggression.
Viv Beck from Heart of the City says the police have responded to the recent incidents very quickly.
Overall, the message we've had from police is that the city centre is a safe place to visit. There's a great offering for people. We've seen two incidents recently that have been responded to very quickly and effectively, and there should be no reason why people aren't feeling comfortable to be here.
Hospitality New Zealand Auckland President Russell Gray insists the central city bars are safe. He says they have to comply with rules that require them to have specially trained staff, security and CCTV.
Notwithstanding that, from time to time we get incidents that, are unsavoury in nature and quite scary for all those involved. But these seem to be isolated one-off things, and I don't think there's any trend.
And Russell Gray says bar owners are ready for the big summer events coming up, like the America's Cup.
It'll be business as usual. We don't expect there to be more challenges than we'd normally have on any busy weekend. And hospitality venues will be well staffed, including good security levels to make sure we provide a really safe, fun environment.
In a statement, the police say they already have an increased presence in the central city over the weekend. But over recent months, they say they've seen an increase in alcohol-fuelled violence and disorder. They say this trend is incredibly disappointing and some of the behaviour they're seeing is unacceptable. The police are already working with bar owners and others to quickly move people out and away from venues come closing time. Mo te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Sarah Robson, aho.
The largest and most complex vaccine distribution program ever undertaken is in the US is now underway. Trucks carrying the first vaccine for public use in America have departed from Pfizer's storage unit in Michigan. Shots could be injected into arms as soon as tomorrow, as the ABC's Catherine Diss reports.
Each specially designed box is tightly packed with enough dry ice to keep the temperature-sensitive vaccine at the required subarctic minus 70 degrees for up to 10 days. The precious cargo was loaded onto trucks before daybreak. Each has GPS tracking to monitor location, temperature, light exposure and motion. Factory workers who've planned this moment for months paused to applaud the achievement. And with that, D-Day, as it's been dubbed, was underway, triggering a logistical challenge never before undertaken in the country. US Marshals escorted the cargo to make sure the first 2.9 million vials of the vaccine made it safely from Pfizer's Kalamazoo factory in Michigan to planes stationed nearby. From there, they'll be flown to cargo hubs in Kentucky and Tennessee before being distributed by truck to the first 145 sites across the country. Shots in arms could start as soon as tomorrow. Here's Food and Drug Administration Commissioner Stephen Hahn.
My hope, again, is that this happens very expeditiously, hopefully tomorrow.
But a large portion of the country remains sceptical to taking the vaccine. Polling shows many don't trust how quickly it was developed or don't think the virus is all that dangerous. There are big questions too that the White House, namely President Donald Trump, publicly and privately pressured authorities to act faster. Stephen Hahn again.
We have been very clear, and I'll say it again here, that nothing guided our decision, no external comments, no external pressure other than the science and data guided our decision-making.
Regaining public trust is a big concern for Monsef Slawi, the chief advisor to America's vaccine task force, Operation Warp Speed. If the nation's to achieve herd immunity, more than 70% of the population need to take it.
We are very concerned by the hesitancy that we see, the level of hesitancy that we see, but we hope that now that all the data is out and available to be discussed in detail, that people will keep their mind open to listen to the data.
The plan is to vaccinate 100 million Americans by February. For that to happen, all the pieces of this carefully planned logistical puzzle need to fall into place. It is the light at the end of the tunnel for this virus-ravaged country and represents a remarkable achievement in public health. But it will come too late for tens of thousands predicted to die here in the latest surge of this virus.
And that was Catherine Diss. Let's get to some of your final thoughts before we head off this Monday on prison and the Ombudsman's report. This listener says, I would like more transparency and surprise visits and more protections for prisoners. There is little rehabilitation from what I've seen. It is cruel. My son is in prison. How do we know what is happening in there? On the trans-Tasman bubble, this person says tourism in Queenstown did not provide sustainable, secure jobs pre-COVID. During COVID, tourism operators received big government payouts and cut their highly casualised workforce like hot spuds. Queenstown needs more vision than simply a return to foreign dollars and foreign worker dependency that it had pre-COVID. It needs sustainable jobs, that listener says. Well, thanks for your company this evening. Don't forget, First Up will be back with you first thing tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. You can check out all our stories online, and we'll see you tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Deputy Head of Oranga Tamariki, Hoani Lambert, has resigned. He's told Checkpoint the Chief Executive, Gráinne Moss, is up to the job and played no part in his departure.